Greetings, VFI News supporters and anyone else watching this report. It's been a very tumultuous week here in Israel as Hamas continues to slow walk the release of the remains of hostages who were murdered in captivity. This is preventing the transition to stage 2 of the ceasefire deal, and that's probably exactly why Hamas is doing it. Meanwhile, things are heating up on the northern border as Hezbollah pursues a path of rearming and reorganizing to take another shot at Israel. Now, the IDF is not standing by and watching this buildup, and there have been many lethal strikes on Hezbollah operatives. Iran is also rebuilding its ballistic missile production capacity while sending mixed signals about its nuclear program. Finally, Israel has been rocked by several internal scandals in the past week, and this is sure to enter into the calculus of all the political factions as the next election looms ever larger on the horizon. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Let's start this week's report with an update from the Gaza Strip, where the IDF is deployed on what's being called the Yellow Line, which runs roughly from north to south and provides a buffer between the cities along the coastline and the border with Israel. This deployment along the Yellow Line was part of the ceasefire agreement, and there are not supposed to be any Hamas personnel on the Israeli side of that Yellow Line. However, this week it came to light that several hundred Hamas operatives were abandoned by their own commanders and left in tunnels underneath the ground running under areas east of the Yellow Line. Some of them apparently still have access to communications equipment, and they tried to call for help, but their superiors in Hamas ignored them. So they called their own families, and those families made a big fuss about it on an X account called Gaza Reports. That big fuss was very embarrassing for Hamas, which all of a sudden began demanding through the mediators that Israel provide a corridor through which these guys could cross unharmed and get back to their own lines. Israel's political echelon reportedly considered this request but then decided against it, instead declaring their intention to wipe these Hamas operatives out. Or if they want to save their own lives, they can surrender. It's important to point out that some of these terrorists emerged from tunnels down in Rafiah over the past couple of weeks and fired at IDF troops there despite the ceasefire. 3 IDF soldiers lost their lives in these attacks, and several more were wounded. Hamas said they had not been able to communicate to everyone about the ceasefire. And since these guys had been among those who hadn't heard, they had launched the attacks on their own initiative. Well, I'm not buying into that, and they are nothing less than terrorists. So it's really a cold comfort for the families of the deceased and wounded soldiers. But there is another aspect to this story, as Hamas has been taking its time returning the remains of slain hostages over the past 3 weeks of this ceasefire. As of the middle of the week, the remains of 8 slain hostages were still unaccounted for, and the IDF believes that Hamas can easily find and return at least half of them, if not all of them, and I hope so by the time you see this news report. The assessment in the intelligence echelon is that Hamas is stalling to buy time to consolidate its position in the Strip ahead of Phase 2 of the agreement, during which they are supposed to fully disarm and hand over administration in the Strip to an international force. But maybe they don't need to buy time because the international force that the plan calls for is running into several different roadblocks. The single biggest roadblock is that there are only a handful of countries that have the capacity and are willing to send troops to support such a force. Among them are Egypt, Qatar, Azerbaijan, Indonesia, and Turkey. Israel has strong objections to Qatar and Turkey deploying forces in Gaza, as both of those countries have close ties to Hamas and the global Muslim Brotherhood movement. They are definitely not neutral and therefore not suitable to take on this mission, so don't be under any delusion about who Qataris really are. However, the other countries that have said they're willing to send soldiers all have their own issues. To start off with, no one wants to have videos of their soldiers getting into a violent confrontation with Hamas flash all over the world news. There's tremendous sympathy for the Palestinians on the Arab and Muslim street. And these governments would face mass protests from their own people if something like that happened. However, at the same time, if troops from Western countries were to get into a violent confrontation with Hamas, that would also be unacceptable to millions of people around the world. So no one really wants to go into Gaza and clean it up because it's impossible to do that without confronting Hamas. And everyone knows that the media would portray that in a negative light. It's unavoidable in this environment. Another idea that's been floated recently is for the Palestinian Authority to play a large role in governing the Strip going forward. But I personally find that idea utterly absurd. The PA can barely manage affairs in the cities it's supposed to be administering in the West Bank, which is Judea and Samaria, the heartland of Israel. In some cities, they are only able to keep the streets clear of Hamas and criminal gangs because of massive assistance from Israel. So how on earth they'd ever be able to move into the Gaza Strip and administer things for the 2 million or so Palestinian Arabs who live there is a mystery to me. So it's hard to say at this point what will happen next in the Gaza Strip. The U.S. has floated a UN Security Council resolution giving it and its partners a mandate to govern the Strip for 2 years starting in January. Frankly, I can think of all kinds of reasons the Russians and Chinese would not want to support such a measure, but we'll see what happens when this resolution comes up for a vote. I wouldn't advise anyone to get their hopes up high about it anyways. In fact, some analysts are beginning to say that it's becoming more likely that the IDF will have to stay deployed on the Yellow Line for a very long time. Since Hamas is already consolidating its position on the western side of the Yellow Line, this might turn into something resembling the divide between East and West Berlin that some of us are old enough to remember from the Cold War days. Candidly, I hope this doesn't end up happening because that would almost guarantee more problems down the road, and I can only imagine how much money it's already costing the IDF to keep this deployment going as it is. Speaking of the government having to spend money on things we'd rather not be spending on, there was a series of high-profile arrests this week, all of which would have been big news if there wasn't already so much going on. I'll start with IDF Major General Ifat Tomer Yerushalmi, the IDF's Judge Advocate General. Over the weekend, a video of Israeli security forces abusing prisoners at an Israeli prison was leaked, and Tomer Yerushalmi later admitted to having authorized the leak of the video. She resigned from her position, wrote a letter to her family, and then disappeared for several hours, during which authorities believe she might be attempting suicide by drowning herself in the sea. However, she was found on the beach north of Tel Aviv and taken into police custody, but her personal phone, which police believe contains evidence that might incriminate her on criminal charges related to this incident, is missing and will probably never be recovered unless it's found in the belly of a whale. Now the government has thickened the plot by appointing an independent investigator for the case, bypassing the Attorney General. The governing coalition has been trying to get rid of the Attorney General, Gali Bacharach Miara, for months because they think she's not impartial and, in fact, acting in direct support of their ideological opponents. That might be true, and it might not be. In any case, the Knesset coalition is acting as if it definitely is, and it's one more part of the struggle between the elected Knesset and the unelected judicial branch of government that has been going on for years, many years now. Another thing that's been ongoing for many years is the debate over ultra-Orthodox young men being drafted into the IDF to serve alongside other Jewish young men and women. I'm all for it. This past week saw another massive street protest in Jerusalem involving an estimated 200,000, can you believe it, ultra-Orthodox young men standing in the middle of the road at the entrance to Jerusalem to block traffic. Large crowds also showed up to block entry to the main train station, the bus station, and other transportation choke points in the city. This made it necessary for many businesses, schools, offices, and other institutions in Jerusalem to just totally shut down early on Thursday. That added another layer of economic hardship to a city that is already struggling with many other problems stemming from this war, including a severe shortage of tourism, which is one of Jerusalem's main industries. Last but certainly not least, this week the chief of the Histadrut Labor Federation, which brings together several of the country's largest labor unions, was taken into custody on suspicion of involvement in a scheme to bribe several elected officials. Some Likud ministers in the current government are also being questioned in this case, and several other officials of the Histadrut are also being investigated. Never a dull moment in Israel, my friends. Well, to switch to commentary mode, my heart is breaking to see that just a few weeks after this terrible war ended, and while we're still burying soldiers and hostages who fell in this conflict, Israel's internal rifts and fissures are back at center stage. I have no idea if the Histadrut chief and his senior aides are guilty of trying to bribe anyone, and I have no idea if senior government officials are guilty of taking bribes. I have no idea what to think in any way whatsoever about this situation with the IDF's Judge Advocate General, the video that was leaked, the decision by the Justice Minister to bypass the Attorney General, or all the rest of it. I have some very strong opinions and feelings about the issue of ultra-Orthodox men not being drafted into the IDF like everyone else is. But I've also been around long enough to know that no one cares what anyone else thinks about this issue, so there's no point in shouting into the wind about it. I could tell you about a dozen other things that are going on in Israel this week that make me sad, angry, and frustrated with our own government, the courts, the Knesset, the municipalities, the police, and everyone else. We don't have dog catchers in Israel, but if we did, they'd probably be giving me heartburn right now, too. That is why it's so important to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, pray for the nation of Israel, and pray for the salvation of the Jewish and Arabs in the Middle East and throughout Israel, from north to south, east to west. What I know for sure is that Israel needs prayer. The Bible tells us to pray for all those in positions of authority, and we definitely need to do that now. I know the politicians in all the countries where people are watching this report also need a lot of prayer, but I'm asking you to spare a few moments and pray for the political, legal, religious, military, economic, and cultural leaders here in Israel, a nation I love and I'm a citizen of. We've got a big mess going on over here, and it's very difficult to imagine how it can ever be cleaned up. On top of everything that the politicians are doing and failing to do, we've got roughly 1 out of 4 Israelis living below the poverty line. We've got struggling families, thousands of them, struggling to make ends meet, pay the bills, and otherwise keep themselves together month in and month out. I mentioned before the lack of tourists in Jerusalem, and it's the same all over, and many smaller towns up in the Galilee and elsewhere which rely on tourism are in very poor shape right now. Many small businesses all over the country are struggling, and many children go to bed hungry every night. And that is why Vision for Israel is doing everything we can to come alongside these struggling communities and families to try and help them in this season of trouble and hardship. So please watch this short video about how you can be part of Vision for Israel and become part of the blessing.
When we go out to the distributions, we just are enjoying to see the people when they come to us and they are so grateful. It's one thing to look at lists of names and all the people coming, but when we see them and when they come and when they sit there and then they meet us, we get to talk to them, we get to learn about their families and their needs beyond what we're giving them. That is the greatest expression of our faith in God and who Yeshua is for us, because if it wasn't for him being the provider for this organization, we wouldn't have what we have to give out. And the greatest of this is to give it with love. And that is our logo, that is our motto, to do it joyfully, to do it with love. We always like when we come together, the staff, make sure that when you go, you're cheering them up. It's not just the giving of the voucher, it's the giving of the spirit, to lift them up spiritually, to let them know that there are people behind them, that the support that we give is not just money, but it's much more than that. And that is our prayer, is for the spiritual and the physical restoration for our people.
We've now provided over 300,000 brand new school packs with their supplies inside for school children of all ages, but particularly the first and second grades. I just love it when we distribute and when a little child comes up and just hugs you on the leg or gives you a big hug and says thank you. And sometimes they may even have a runny nose. I think it's like one of the cutest things. It melts my heart so much. And I'm going, wow, I hope that when they grow up to be an adult and maybe they've been through the army and university and they have a profession, maybe that memory will stay with them for all those years and decades. Welcome back, friends. Now I need to switch tracks and talk about the ongoing external threats to Israel, particularly on our northern border. Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed Shiite terrorist group that has held the land of the Cedars hostage for a generation now, got hammered pretty hard in a short and very decisive battle a year ago this month. They lost most of their senior and mid-level leadership, hundreds of lower-level leaders and their fighters, an estimated 80% of their arsenal of rockets, missiles, and UAVs, and much more destroyed. Smuggling routes running from northwestern Iraq to Lebanon, which Iran used to move money, weapons, ammunition, and equipment to Hezbollah, were shut down. Underground factories and weapons depots that Hezbollah was using to produce and store weapons in Syria and Lebanon were demolished. And most of the tunnels and bunkers that Hezbollah had set up in southern Lebanon, meant to be used as a staging ground for attacks into the Galilee region of northern Israel, were found and demolished by the IDF as it initiated a ground incursion. Hezbollah's main headquarters and other infrastructure in Beirut were bombed to rubble. Finally, the internationally recognized government of Lebanon found the courage to speak up for everyone in the country to say they are fed up with Hezbollah and Iran using their country as a platform to attack Israel, and they want that to change. All of that was even before the overthrow of the Assad regime in Syria, which was followed by the rise of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, a former al-Qaeda leader who claimed to have put his jihadist past behind him and embraced the role of a pragmatic statesman. He too opposes Hezbollah and Iran, giving him a common cause with Israel. Fast forward this month, and the situation in Israel's northern arena is far from settled and far from peaceful. Hezbollah has taken many more hits, including the loss of dozens of its surviving field operatives and commanders, taken out by almost daily Israeli airstrikes. The Lebanese National Army has also cleared out a great many Hezbollah positions and weapons storage depots in southern Lebanon, but is much less active north of the Litani River, leaving Hezbollah a strategic rear area to rebuild, which is exactly what it's trying to do now. Iran, which is falling apart internally and is under enormous diplomatic, economic, and even military pressure to discontinue its nuclear weapons program, is continuing to send money and weapons to Hezbollah. Where do they get all this money? New land routes have been found, and the old air route using commercial planes landing at Beirut's international airport has been partially restored, and the occasional ship from Iran still docks in the port of Beirut, presumably also carrying resources for Hezbollah. Now, Israeli intelligence officials are now estimating that Hezbollah has roughly one-third of the number of rockets, missiles, and UAVs it had before they started firing into Israel on October 8, 2023. It's less clear how many launchers they have and how many trained fighters they have who can operate the launchers. But these are things that can be acquired if enough time and money are expended. But Iran is not just continuing to spend time, effort, and money rearming Hezbollah. The regime is also working hard to rearm their own ballistic missile forces. This past week, reports emerged that 2,000 tons of sodium perchlorate, a chemical compound that is used in the fuel for Iran's ballistic missiles, arrived in Iran from China. Thanks, China. China is aware that Iran is under a UN-mandated arms embargo, but sodium perchlorate has also industrial uses that are not military in nature. So China is pretending it thinks that's probably what Iran wants it for. No one is fooled by this, but China has never been known to be overly concerned with that sort of thing. In any case, senior officials of the Ayatollah regime are making all kinds of threatening statements this week, along with the concrete measures they are taking to try and rebuild their arsenal of ballistic missiles as well as the nuclear program. To switch briefly to commentary mode, I find it remarkable and deeply tragic that the people of Iran and Lebanon are governed by such a ridiculous group of barbarians, evil, twisted, sadistic lunatics. The economic conditions of both countries can only be described as catastrophic, but these regimes continue to spend all their resources and energy on trying to attack Israel, a country that has just demonstrated that it has total military superiority over them. The damage done to Israel by all of Hezbollah's rockets and all of Iran's ballistic missiles over the last 2 years adds up to around 7 billion shekels, according to the National Insurance Institute. That's around $2 billion US, give or take, and it's certainly not nothing. But Israel's annual GDP is around 500 billion US dollars, and so this damage is certainly manageable. By comparison, southern Lebanon and Beirut, as well as Iran, all suffered massive damage from this war and gained absolutely nothing from it. There's an old saying that when you're in a hole, you should stop digging. But the Ayatollah regime in Iran and its proxy force Hezbollah in Lebanon don't seem to think so. They're busy trying to get themselves set up to take another crack at us. And I think part of the reason for this is what they are refusing to be honest about with themselves about what just happened. The statements by Iranian and Hezbollah officials downplay the damage they suffered and massively exaggerate what they were able to inflict on Israel. I saw one commentator in Canada who said with apparent certainty that he had been told by an IRGC general that almost one-third of Israel had been destroyed and Israel had begged the Americans to get Iran to agree to a ceasefire before things got even worse. Oh my Lord. I can understand why the regime puts out this narrative. Like all totalitarian regimes and police states, it understands that if it appears weak in front of its own population, it is an invitation for that population to rise up and overthrow it. It is also important here in the Middle East not to look weak in front of other countries, because that's also an invitation for aggression. But the problem is, the Ayatollah regime seems to believe its own fairy tales. They believe they won the 12-day war, and they've talked themselves into thinking that another round will finish Israel off. And maybe this time the Americans won't get involved, especially if they're distracted by the war in Ukraine or possibly a Chinese move against Taiwan. Now, there's one more thing that needs to be mentioned in this context, and that's the fact that although Iran has some of the components it needs to restart their production lines of ballistic missiles, there are some things it needs that they don't have. They don't have the heavy machinery called planetary mixers, which actually bring all the components together to produce the final product. They are also short on skilled engineers and other workers needed to build new facilities, which can replace what Israel destroyed in the war. However, it is also important to remember that if and when they do get all the manufacturing facilities back up and running, they'll be able to produce ballistic missiles much faster and cheaper than Israel can manufacture Arrow 2 and 3 interceptors, a large percentage of which were expended in the 12-day war. With all this in mind, Vision for Israel must and is continuing to place bomb safety shelters and support civilian emergency response teams all over Israel. This includes paramedics, firefighters, and even the police. There might be a ceasefire in Gaza and on the northern border, but everyone knows that the situation is fragile, and we could be back in an emergency situation at any moment. So please watch this short video about what VFI is doing about it. After October 7th, 2023, which was considered the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, security teams were devastated along the southern border of Israel. From October 8th onwards, also Hezbollah in Lebanon, a terror group, also attacked in the northern part of Israel. Security teams turned to Vision for Israel for extra aid and help, and many of the items that we provided were ceramic vests for security teams to avoid bullet wounds as well as shrapnel wounds. We also needed to provide proper helmets. Most of these security teams had outdated equipment that hadn't been replaced in decades. In addition to that, there was a request for medic bags and defibrillators and for all sorts of medical disposables that were needed. Then as a result of these rocket attacks, also fires were erupting, and so we were requested to provide firefighting equipment and generators and protective clothing in order to put out these fires. And so Vision for Israel is very happy to come alongside the civilian security teams, the community security teams. We even bought a new police vehicle for one of the southern cities and dedicated it together with the mayor. It was in the city of Sderot, which was badly hit during the first days of the war. And the requests keep coming in, and we will continue to keep providing. Welcome back, friends. I know it's been very heavy this week, but I want to continue the tradition of always ending the report with some good news. So here it is. Israel Aircraft Industries is expected to win a tender worth almost $1 billion to convert passenger planes to mid-air refuelers for the Indian Air Force. The deal is one of the several large contracts Israeli companies have landed with India in recent weeks. These deals will preserve and create thousands of jobs in Israel and also anchor India as a strategic partner going forward. So with that in mind, I'm Barry Siegel, and this has been another edition of VFI News from Israel. Shalom, shalom, my friends.